There's a house on Phillip Street in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. Number 66. To walk past it today, you'd never know that once, in the years before the Civil War, the man who lived there kept barrels of gunpowder near his front door. He told slave catchers that if they tried to enter, he'd blow the whole place sky high rather than let them take a single person back to bondage. And he meant every word of it. His name was Lewis Hayden. Born into slavery in Kentucky in 1811, he would become one of the most fearless conductors on the Underground Railroad, a man who led courthouse raids to free captured fugitives, who sheltered hundreds of people fleeing bondage, who recruited soldiers for the 1st Black Regiment from the North, and who eventually served in the Massachusetts state legislature. But before all of that, he was a child watching his family torn apart on an auction block. And that's where this story begins. Lewis Hayden was born on December 2, 1811, in Lexington, Kentucky, into the household of Reverend Adam Rankin, a Presbyterian minister. He was one of a family of 25 siblings. His mother was of mixed African, European, and Native American ancestry. And, from his earliest years, Lewis understood exactly what slavery meant, because he watched it destroy the people he loved most. When Lewis was 7 or 8 years old, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His mother refused a sexual advance from a man connected to a Masonic lodge. For her defiance, she was brutally beaten. The torture was so severe that it broke something in her mind. She began having what people at the time called crazy turns, fits of madness brought on by the horror of what had been done to her. During one of these episodes, young Lewis and his siblings were brought to see her. She looked at her son with wild, desperate eyes and screamed at him. "I'll fix you so they'll never get you," she said. She was trying to kill him. Not out of hatred, but out of love. She wanted to spare him from the life she knew awaited him. Before she could act, she was tied up and taken away. Lewis never saw his mother again. After that, Reverend Rankin sold off Lewis's brothers and sisters to different owners. The family of 25 was scattered like seeds in the wind. Lewis himself was traded for a pair of carriage horses and a carriage. He was considered property of equal value to livestock and a wagon. This is what it meant to be enslaved. This is what it meant to have no legal right to your own body, to your own family, to your own future. Lewis was passed from master to master around Lexington. At one point he was traded to a cabinet maker for horses. He learned to read in secret, hiding away with a Bible and newspapers, teaching himself the words that slaveholders tried to keep from enslaved people because literacy was dangerous. It gave people ideas. It made them realize that the words about all men being created equal might actually apply to them too. In the mid-1830s, Lewis married a woman named Esther Harvey, who was also enslaved. They had 2 sons together. One died shortly after birth. But Lewis and Esther had hope for their surviving child. They had dreams of somehow staying together as a family, even within the bonds of slavery. Then those dreams were destroyed by a man whose name would echo through American history. Esther and their son belonged to a different master than Lewis. When that master's debts came due, Esther and the boy were sold to satisfy those debts. The man who purchased them was Henry Clay, the powerful U.S. Senator from Kentucky, one of the architects of the Compromise of 1850, a man who presented himself as a moderate on the question of slavery. Clay kept Esther and Lewis's son for about 2 years, then sold them to a slave trader headed for the Deep South. Lewis begged Clay not to do it. He pleaded to be allowed to keep his family together. Clay sold them anyway, Lewis never saw his wife or child again. Years later, after Lewis had escaped to freedom, he wrote publicly about what Henry Clay had done. He described the moment when Esther came to tell him she'd been sold. "It was an unexpected moment to me when the deed was done," he wrote. "I was at my unrequited toil when my poor wife came to me informing me of her having been sold. Yes, sold by that friend of the colored race, Henry Clay." He was challenging Clay's public image, exposing the hypocrisy of a man who claimed to oppose slavery while actively profiting from it. Clay would later deny the story, but Lewis provided specific details about where Esther had been housed, details that only someone who had lived through it could know. Looking back on the loss of his son, Lewis would write something that captures the unbearable pain of slavery's violence against families. "I have one child who is buried in Kentucky," he said, "and that grave is pleasant to think of. I've got another that is sold nobody knows where, and that I can never bear to think of." The child whose grave he could visit, whose resting place he knew, brought him a measure of peace. But the child who had been sold into the vast system of American slavery, who could be anywhere, who might as well have vanished from the earth, that loss was too much to bear. Despite everything, Lewis found the courage to love again. Around 1840 he married Harriet Bell, a woman who was enslaved at a hat factory in Lexington. Harriet had a son from a previous relationship, a boy named Joseph. Lewis accepted Joseph as his own child, and this time Lewis made a decision. He would not stand by and watch another family be destroyed. If they were going to stay together, they would have to run. But escaping from Kentucky wasn't simple. Lewis was enslaved by two businessmen who rented him out to the Phoenix Hotel as a waiter, particularly during racing season when wealthy travelers passed through Lexington. Harriet and Joseph belonged to yet another master. Any escape would require precise planning, outside help, and extraordinary courage. The punishment for attempted escape was brutal. Lewis had seen what happened to people who tried and failed. Then, in 1844, two white abolitionists came into Lewis's life. Calvin Fairbank was a Methodist minister and Underground Railroad conductor from western New York. Delia Webster was a schoolteacher from Vermont. Both were committed to helping enslaved people reach freedom, and they were willing to risk everything to do it. When they met Lewis and learned that he wanted to escape with his wife and son, they agreed to help. On a cold, rainy Saturday evening, September 28, 1844, the plan went into action. Fairbank and Webster rented a carriage and driver. Lewis and Harriet disguised themselves as Yankee travelers. At times, they rubbed flour on their faces to appear white. Joseph hid under the seat of the carriage, staying silent and still for hours. They would have to pass through 13 toll gates and 8 communities on the 64-mile journey from Lexington to Maysville on the Ohio River. About 30 miles into the journey, one of the horses became sick, possibly from a botfly larva infection. They were forced to stop at an inn just beyond Millersburg. The proprietor, William Holliday, came out to see what assistance he could offer. When he learned the horse was sick, he offered to trade one of his own horses, keeping the sick animal until their return trip. He had no idea he was helping a family escape from slavery. That simple act of hospitality became an accidental contribution to freedom. They continued through the night, finally reaching the Ohio River. They crossed by ferry to Aberdeen, Ohio, then made their way to Ripley, where they were met by John Rankin, one of the most active Underground Railroad conductors in the region. From Ripley, they continued north to Red Oak and then to Canada. They had made it. Lewis, Harriet, and Joseph were free. but freedom came at a terrible cost for the people who had helped them. When Calvin Fairbank and Delia Webster returned to Kentucky, they were arrested. The driver was picked up and whipped 50 times until he confessed to helping the Haydens escape. Webster was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor but was pardoned after just a few months. Fairbank wasn't so fortunate. He was sentenced to 15 years, 5 years for each slave he had helped to freedom. He would serve 4 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary before Lewis Hayden did something remarkable. By 1849, Lewis had established himself in Boston and had begun to earn money. When he learned that Fairbank could be pardoned if Lewis's former owner was paid $650, Lewis sprang into action. He raised the money from 160 people, collecting small contributions from supporters throughout Boston. He ransomed Calvin Fairbank, repaying the man who had given him and his family freedom. It was an act of extraordinary gratitude and determination. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. After reaching Canada, the Haydens stayed for about 4 months, settling initially in the town of Sandwich, Ontario. Lewis founded a school for black children there and helped establish a brick church for the Colored Methodist Society. But Lewis wasn't content to simply enjoy his own freedom. He wanted to be where he could do the most good, where he could fight slavery most effectively. So, in January 1846, the Hayden family moved to Boston, Massachusetts. Boston, in the 1840s, was a center of the abolitionist movement. The city had a thriving free black community of about 2,500 people, and was home to some of the most prominent white abolitionists in the nation, including William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Theodore Parker. For a man like Lewis Hayden, who had experienced slavery firsthand and was determined to fight it, Boston was exactly where he needed to be. Lewis opened a clothing store on Cambridge Street. It would eventually become the second largest black-owned business in Boston. But the store was more than just a business. It became a meeting place for abolitionists and a source of clothing for people escaping slavery. Lewis would outfit fugitives with new clothes, giving them the appearance of respectability that might help them avoid suspicion as they made their way north. Harriet, meanwhile, ran a boarding house from their home on Southack Street, which is now 66 Phillips Street. But this wasn't just any boarding house. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And Lewis and Harriet Hayden were about to become 2 of the most active conductors in Boston. In 1848, Lewis began working as an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, traveling and speaking about his experiences in slavery. He wasn't a polished speaker at first. Only 3 years removed from bondage, he lacked the formal education and oratorical training of men like Frederick Douglass or Wendell Phillips. In February 1848, he received a crushing letter from the society informing him that his agency was being stopped. He had already spent about 2 months' income preparing for a lecture tour. He didn't even have the fare to get back home. Lewis could have given up. He could have accepted that he simply wasn't eloquent enough, educated enough, refined enough to be an abolitionist leader. Instead, he wrote back to the society with words that reveal his determination. "You all know it is me just 3 years from slavery," he wrote, maintaining his own voice rather than trying to adopt the formal language of the educated elite. "If I am not Wendell Phillips now, it ought not to appear what shall be. I shall do all I can to make myself a man." Those words capture something essential about Lewis Hayden. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him he couldn't fight for freedom just because he didn't speak like the Boston aristocracy. He would make himself into whatever he needed to be. And he did. By 1849, the Boston City Directory listed him as a lecturer. He had persevered. But it was his work on the Underground Railroad that would make Lewis Hayden legendary. When Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in September 1850, it fundamentally changed the landscape for freedom seekers. The new law required federal officials to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. It offered financial incentives to commissioners who ruled in favor of slaveholders. It denied alleged fugitives the right to testify on their own behalf. It meant that nowhere in the United States was truly safe for people who had escaped slavery. They could be seized at any moment and sent back to bondage. Boston's abolitionists responded by forming a new vigilance committee, and Lewis Hayden was a key member. The committee's purpose was to protect fugitive slaves by any means necessary. They would post lookouts to watch for slave catchers. They would warn the community when bounty hunters arrived in the city. They would provide legal assistance, financial support, and safe shelter. And, when necessary, they would use direct action to prevent people from being taken back to slavery. According to the records of the Boston Vigilance Committee, between 1850 and 1860, Lewis and Harriet Hayden sheltered hundreds of people at their Phillips Street home. The house contained a secret tunnel and hiding places. When slave catchers came looking for fugitives, Lewis was ready for them. One of the most famous incidents involved a couple named Ellen and William Craft, who had escaped from Georgia in 1848 in one of the most audacious escapes in American history. Ellen, who had light skin, had disguised herself as a white male slaveholder, while William pretended to be her slave. After the Fugitive Slave Act passed, warrants were issued for the Crafts' arrest. 2 slave catchers from Georgia, Willis Hughes and John Knight, came to Boston to seize them. Lewis Hayden sheltered William Craft in his home. He barricaded his doorway and armed himself heavily. When the slave catchers approached, Lewis made his position clear. He told them he had barrels of gunpowder stored near his front door. If they tried to enter, he would ignite the powder and blow the entire house to pieces rather than let them take William Craft back to slavery. He was ready to die, and to take everyone with him, rather than allow a single person to be returned to bondage. The slave catchers backed down. They couldn't risk it. The Crafts eventually made their way to England, where they lived until after the Civil War. But the message Lewis sent reverberated through Boston's abolitionist community. Here was a man who would not compromise. Here was a man who would use whatever means necessary to protect human freedom. On February 15, 1851, Lewis Hayden participated in one of the most dramatic rescues in American history. A man named Shadrach Minkins, who had escaped from slavery in Virginia and was working as a waiter in Boston, was arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act. Federal marshals took him to the courthouse for a hearing that would determine whether he would be sent back to Virginia. Word spread quickly through Boston's black community. Hundreds of people, black and white, crowded into the courthouse. Prominent attorneys came to offer legal assistance. But as the hearing dragged on, some people decided that legal remedies wouldn't be enough. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a group of approximately 20 black men, led by Lewis Hayden, stormed the courthouse. They burst through 2 sets of doors. Inside, deputy marshals guarded Minkins, but they were overwhelmed by the determination of the rescuers. 4 or 5 men grabbed Minkins and roughly carried him out of the courthouse, his clothes partially torn off in the struggle. They rushed him down Court Street with 200 or more people following like the tail of a comet, as one witness described it. The deputy marshals either didn't pursue or gave up after just a few blocks. Lewis Hayden and attorney Robert Morris took charge of Minkins. They hid him briefly in the attic of a widow who lived near Lewis's home on Beacon Hill. That night, Lewis and John J. Smith, another black leader from Boston, drove Minkins by horse and carriage to Concord, arriving at 3 o'clock Sunday morning. They left him with Francis and Anne Bigelow, who fed him breakfast while he struggled to stay awake from exhaustion and anxiety. From Concord, Minkins was taken to Leominster, and from there he made his way along the Underground Railroad to Canada. He settled in Montreal, where he lived as a free man for the rest of his life. President Millard Fillmore was furious about the rescue. He ordered that everyone involved be prosecuted. 9 abolitionists were indicted, including Lewis Hayden. When Lewis went to trial, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. A hung jury meant no conviction. Lewis walked free. The federal government had tried to make an example of the rescuers, but they had failed. Boston's abolitionists had won. 3 years later, in May 1854, another fugitive slave case would grip the city. Anthony Burns, a 20-year-old man who had escaped from Virginia and was working in a clothing store in Boston, was arrested and taken to the courthouse. This time, the rescue attempt wouldn't succeed, but Lewis Hayden would be at the center of it. On the night of May 26th, as a protest meeting was being held at Faneuil Hall, word spread that abolitionists were gathering at the courthouse to rescue Burns. Lewis Hayden and Worcester clergyman Thomas Wentworth Higginson led a group that attempted to storm the courthouse. They used a wooden beam as a battering ram against the doors. They broke through, and a violent confrontation erupted between the rescuers and the deputy marshals guarding Burns. In the chaos, a deputy marshal named James Batchelder collapsed with a wound to his groin and died minutes later. Someone had shot or stabbed him. To this day, historians debate who killed Batchelder, but many believe it was Lewis Hayden. He was never charged with the marshal's death, but the suspicion followed him. What's certain is that Lewis was willing to use violence if necessary to prevent people from being returned to slavery. He believed that some things were worth fighting for, worth killing for, worth dying for, and human freedom was at the top of that list. The rescue attempt failed. President Franklin Pierce declared that the law must be executed. Troops poured into Boston, Marines and soldiers, thousands of them. On June 2, 1854, Anthony Burns was marched through the streets of Boston, surrounded by federal troops, while 50,000 protesters lined the route. Black banners hung from windows. Someone suspended a coffin from a building with the inscription, "The Funeral of Liberty." People shouted, "Shame! Shame!" as Burns was put on a ship and sent back to Virginia. The cost of returning one man to slavery was $40,000, a staggering sum in 1854. Boston was placed under what felt like military occupation. The sight of federal troops forcing a black man back to bondage, while tens of thousands of citizens protested, had a profound effect on public opinion. Many people who had been neutral on slavery became abolitionists that day. The Anthony Burns case helped push the nation closer to civil war. But Lewis Hayden's fight against slavery wasn't confined to Boston. In 1858, a white abolitionist named John Brown came to the Hayden home. Brown was planning something audacious and dangerous. He intended to raid the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, seize weapons, and spark an armed uprising of enslaved people. Brown stayed at the Haydens' house while he was in Boston, and Lewis came to respect him as a man of action. Lewis helped Brown in several ways. He recruited 6 free black men to participate in the raid, though only one could make it to Virginia in time. Lewis also helped raise money for the expedition. On one occasion, Lewis ran into Francis Merriam, the grandson of the treasurer of Boston's Vigilance Committee. Lewis told Merriam he needed $500 immediately. When Merriam asked what it was for, Lewis explained Brown's plans. Merriam not only gave the money but volunteered to join the raid himself. Lewis's endorsement carried weight. People trusted his judgment about what actions were worth taking in the fight against slavery. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 failed. Brown and most of his men were captured or killed. Brown himself was hanged for treason. But the raid terrified the South and convinced many Southerners that the North was preparing for a war to end slavery. The raid helped trigger the very conflict John Brown had hoped for, even if he didn't live to see it. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, Lewis Hayden threw himself into the war effort. He worked closely with Governor John Andrew, who had become a friend. In fact, Andrew had Thanksgiving dinner at the Hayden's home in 1862. It was Lewis who first suggested to Andrew that he run for governor, recognizing that having an abolitionist in that position would be crucial for the cause. When the federal government finally authorized the recruitment of black troops, Lewis became one of the most effective recruiters for the Massachusetts 54th Infantry Regiment, the first black regiment raised in the North. He knew that black men fighting in Union uniforms would strike a powerful blow against the ideology of white supremacy. If black soldiers could fight as bravely as white soldiers, if they could discipline themselves and follow orders and show courage under fire, it would undermine every argument that had been made to justify slavery. The 54th Massachusetts went on to prove themselves at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where they suffered devastating casualties, but fought with such courage that they changed minds across the nation about what black soldiers could accomplish. Lewis's son, Joseph, served in the Union Navy during the war and was killed in action. Lewis paid a personal price for the cause of freedom, just as he had paid a price throughout his entire life. But Lewis Hayden's work wasn't finished when the war ended. He continued to fight for justice on multiple fronts. He worked to integrate Boston's public schools, partnering with other community leaders like William Cooper Nell to challenge segregation. In the late 1850s, he had been appointed as messenger to the Massachusetts Secretary of State, likely one of the first black state employees in Massachusetts. He held this position for 30 years, earning the nickname Old Philosopher in the State House for his wisdom and dedication. In 1873, Lewis Hayden was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, becoming one of the first black legislators in the state. During his term, he served on the Committee on Woman Suffrage and became a strong advocate for women's right to vote. He remembered the women who had fought alongside him in the abolitionist movement, women like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and he believed they deserved full citizenship. "My race can never repay the debt we owe to such as these," he said. "I should be indeed an ingrate if I did not work and vote for the enfranchisement of women." Lewis also led the campaign to erect a monument to Crispus Attucks on Boston Common, honoring the black man who was killed in the Boston Massacre and was considered the first casualty of the American Revolution. The monument was finally erected in 1887, 2 years before Lewis's death. He understood that history mattered, that memorials mattered, that it was crucial to preserve the memory of black Americans who had fought for freedom. As a Prince Hall Mason, Lewis worked to establish black Masonic lodges throughout New England. He eventually served as Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Massachusetts. This work was about more than fraternal organization. It was about creating institutions that Black Americans could control, where they could support each other and build community without depending on white approval or permission. Lewis Hayden died on April 7, 1889, at his home on 66 Phillips Street. He was 77 years old. His death was front-page news in Boston and was covered by the New York Times. The funeral was attended by some of the most prominent figures in America. Frederick Douglass was there. Lucy Stone, the women's rights leader, attended. The governor of Massachusetts came. The mayor of Boston came. The secretary of the Commonwealth came. All of them understood that they were saying goodbye to someone extraordinary. The Boston Common Council passed a resolution honoring Lewis as one of the pioneers in the freeing of this country from the curse of slavery. William Bowditch, a physician and fellow abolitionist who had worked with Lewis for decades, wrote something that captured the man's essence. Lewis Hayden's career from first to last ought to prove a beacon light to every one of us, he wrote. God grant that we may not shut our eyes to the way it points out to us. 4 years later, in 1893, Harriet Hayden died. She had fought alongside Lewis for nearly 50 years, sheltering fugitives, feeding the hungry, providing clothes for people who had escaped with nothing but the rags on their backs. And in her will, Harriet did something that demonstrated the forward-looking vision that she and Lewis had always shared. She bequeathed her entire estate, approximately $5,000, to Harvard Medical School to establish the Lewis and Harriet Hayden Scholarship for colored students. It was a profound act. Lewis and Harriet understood that education was power, that access to institutions like Harvard was essential if Black Americans were going to have real opportunities in the society they had helped to save. The scholarship continues to this day. Over the years, it has helped dozens of Black students attend Harvard Medical School, students who have gone on to become doctors, researchers, and educators. They are part of Lewis and Harriet Hayden's legacy, carrying forward the couple's commitment to opening doors that had been closed. The house on Phillips Street still stands. It's a private residence now, not open to the public, but it's a stop on Boston's Black Heritage Trail. A historical marker tells part of the story, describing it as a meeting place of abolitionists and a station on the Underground Railroad. But those words can't fully capture what happened in that house. They can't convey the fear of the people who hid there, listening for footsteps that might mean slave catchers had come. They can't capture Harriet cooking meals for 13 newly escaped slaves at once, as she did when Harriet Beecher Stowe visited in 1853 to gather material for her book A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. They can't capture Lewis standing at his door, armed and ready to die rather than let one more person be dragged back to slavery. What Lewis Hayden's story tells us is something essential about the nature of freedom and resistance. He showed us that freedom isn't given. It's taken, it's fought for, it's defended with everything you have. Lewis could have been content with his own escape. He and Harriet could have lived quiet lives in Canada or Boston, grateful for their own liberty and unwilling to risk it by harboring fugitives or storming courthouses. But that wasn't who they were. Lewis understood something that every enslaved person understood, but that many free people refused to acknowledge. Slavery was a war. It was a war waged by white people against Black people, a war that used the full power of the law, the courts, the police, and the military to maintain bondage. If you were going to fight slavery, you had to understand that you were fighting a war, and you couldn't win a war by politely asking your enemy to surrender. This is why Lewis kept gunpowder near his door. This is why he stormed the courthouse to rescue Shadrach Minkins. This is why he was willing to use violence against the deputy marshals who guarded Anthony Burns. He understood that the Fugitive Slave Act was violence. Slavery itself was violence. Every day that a person was held in bondage was an act of violence, and sometimes the only response to violence is greater violence applied in the cause of justice. But Lewis Hayden was more than a warrior. He was also a statesman, a businessman, a recruiter, an organizer, a legislator, and a visionary. After the Civil War, when the immediate fight against slavery was won, he didn't retire. He kept working for integration, for women's suffrage, for the preservation of Black history, for the education of the next generation. He understood that abolition was just the beginning, that true freedom would require building institutions, changing laws, and transforming society. In many ways, Lewis Hayden represents the best of what America could be, even as his story reveals some of the worst of what America was. He was born into a system designed to destroy him, to reduce him to property, to deny him every human dignity. That system took his mother from him, sold his siblings away, stole his first wife and child, and marked him for life with trauma that he carried until his final breath. But that system could not break him. It could not make him accept his own subjugation. It could not convince him that freedom wasn't worth fighting for. And when he gained his own freedom, he didn't hoard it. He shared it. He risked it. He used it as a platform to help others. The hundreds of people who passed through his house on Phillip Street, the men he recruited for the 54th Massachusetts, the students who benefited from the scholarship that bears his and Harriet's names, all of them are evidence that Lewis understood freedom as something collective, not individual. You weren't truly free if your brothers and sisters were still in chains. You had an obligation to use whatever freedom you had to help others. There's a photograph of Lewis taken late in his life. He's an older man by then, his hair gray, his face lined. He's wearing a suit, looking dignified and prosperous. Nothing in the photograph reveals what he endured or what he accomplished. You can't see the scars from slavery. You can't see the courage it took to escape. You can't see the gunpowder barrels or the courthouse raids or the fugitives hiding in the attic. You can't see any of it. He just looks like a respectable elderly gentleman. But that's the point, isn't it? The system of slavery wanted to make Black people invisible, to reduce them to things without stories or histories or dreams. Men like Lewis Hayden refused that erasure. They insisted on their own humanity, their own complexity, their own right to be remembered not as victims or as abstractions, but as individuals who made choices, who acted with agency, who shaped history. Today, when we talk about the Underground Railroad, we often speak in metaphors and generalities. We talk about brave conductors and freedom seekers without naming names or telling specific stories. We sanitize it, make it safe for school children, turn it into a tale of good people helping other good people. And, while that's not entirely wrong, it misses something crucial. It misses the violence. It misses the risk. It misses men like Lewis Hayden standing at their doors with guns and gunpowder, ready to kill or die. The Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad at all. It was a network of people willing to break the law, to commit what the government called crimes, to use violence when necessary, all in the service of human freedom. It was people like Calvin Fairbank and Delia Webster going to prison for years. It was Harriet Tubman carrying a pistol and threatening to shoot anyone who tried to turn back. It was Lewis Hayden leading a mob into a courthouse to grab a man from federal custody. This wasn't genteel charity. This was resistance. This was warfare. And it worked. Not because it was polite or legal or approved by authorities, but because people were willing to sacrifice everything for a cause larger than themselves. The Lewis Hayden who traded for carriage horses, who watched his mother tortured into madness, who lost his first wife and child to Henry Clay's greed. That Lewis could have become bitter, could have surrendered to despair, could have decided that nothing he did would matter. Instead, he became a man who changed history. The scholarship that Lewis and Harriet established at Harvard Medical School continues to award funds to black students every year. In recent years, recipients have included students who have gone on to become leaders in medicine, public health, and research. They carry forward a legacy that began in a house on Phillip Street, in a time when black people were fighting just for the right to be considered human. Those students stand on the shoulders of Lewis and Harriet Hayden, whether they know it or not, and that's perhaps the most powerful part of Lewis Hayden's legacy, the way it continues to ripple forward through time. Every person he helped escape from slavery went on to build a life, to have children, to contribute to their communities. Those children had children, who had children, creating family trees that spread across the nation. How many thousands of people alive today owe their existence to the fact that Lewis Hayden sheltered their ancestor in 1851, or 1854, or 1858? How many doctors, teachers, artists, activists trace their lineage back to someone who passed through 66 Phillip Street? We can't count them. We'll never know. But they're there, living their lives, pursuing their dreams, completely unaware that they exist because a man born into slavery in Kentucky decided that freedom was worth any price. That's what this story is really about. Not just one man, however remarkable, but the countless lives that one man touched, saved, inspired, and changed. Lewis Hayden's story reminds us that individuals matter, that one person's courage can alter the course of history, that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict or understand. In a nation that wanted him to be invisible, Lewis Hayden made himself impossible to ignore. In a system designed to crush his spirit, he remained unbroken. In a society that told him he was property, he insisted on his humanity and fought for the humanity of others. He was born in bondage and died in dignity, and the path between those 2 points was marked by courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The house on Phillip Street stands as a testament to that journey, and every time someone walks the Black Heritage Trail and pauses at that marker, they're connecting with a history that's often uncomfortable, often violent, always complicated, but absolutely essential to understanding who we are as a nation. Lewis Hayden's life asks us a question. When freedom is under threat, when justice demands action, when the law itself has become a tool of oppression, what will you do? Will you keep your head down and protect yourself? Or will you stand at your door with gunpowder and conviction, ready to risk everything for what you know is right? Lewis Hayden gave his answer, and in doing so, he gave us a blueprint for resistance, a model of courage, and a reminder that freedom is never free. It's paid for in sacrifice and struggle, in the currency of human dedication and resolve. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's paid for by people who started with nothing, who had every reason to give up, who had been told their entire lives that they were worth less than livestock, and who decided to prove the entire world wrong.